I'm here with Jenn Smith. And Jenn, I reached out to you because you are currently trying to raise awareness about what's happening in Canada. And I don't know exactly what it is that you're doing because I'm here in the US and I'm a little bit oblivious to how things work in Canada. So, do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself and what it is that you're doing?
Well, if people can't tell, I'm a transgender identified individual. I'm also a public speaker, a political activist, and a child protection advocate. And I have, for the last 3 years, been writing and public speaking and staging rallies and protests around the province of British Columbia. And I've really engaged activists of similar thinking all across Canada for the last, well, it's more than 3 years now. And I've been trying to raise awareness to the fact that our most vulnerable children, that would be foster children, children with autism, children with various emotional and psychological problems, are identifying as the opposite sex, so gender dysphoric, at startlingly high rates. So these sort of vulnerable youths are identifying as transgender at rates 15 to 20 times higher and more, depending on what category you're looking at, than the regular population. And I'm also a former foster child. So when I learned that foster children in British Columbia, so as a former foster child, when I found out that foster kids were identifying as transgender at rates that startling. Like they estimate, for instance, that 1 in 200 people, the last estimates I looked at, were identifying as transgender. And in the in the foster child demographic, if you will, it may be as high as 1 in 10 who are identifying
Oh,
as gender dysphoric. And when I saw this, and this came out of information that was released by the primary gender doctor in British Columbia. So like it's just based on what he said. So we need more information there. So that was alarming to me as a former foster child to think that these kids were being preyed upon. So I sort of upped my game because I had been sort of protesting this all along. But when I got that information, I really stepped into overdrive and said, okay, this is ridiculous. We need a national inquiry. We need to know what's going on. So I began sort of pushing at that stage for a national inquiry to make sure that these kids aren't being preyed upon.
and if the rates are that high, or even if they're half that high or a third that high, it's shocking. And based on the information that I'm getting here in the U.S., the rates of autistic kids is incredibly high. I haven't seen any information about foster kids, but it wouldn't surprise me because based on my experience as a kid and having a trans identity as a coping mechanism, and talking to other people who developed a trans identity as a coping mechanism, it would make sense that foster kids would be more inclined to take on that identity because they tend to have more trauma.
Right. Okay. So this gets into my own personal experience. Okay. So I was a foster child. I went through 6 different homes altogether before I was emancipated at the age of 16, and a lot of movement when I was very, very young. And that's very sort of traumatizing for a child. And it also sort of strips you of any sort of sense of self esteem and belonging. And I would say identity, a sense of identity is stripped from you as well. So at a very young age, in one of the foster homes that I was in, and I should sort of expand on that a bit, because not only was I sort of, moved through home after home and felt all this rejection, but I was also sort of a very emotional, kind of unusual kid. So I was viciously bullied in school. Okay, so you add all of that together, and you've got a child who's like feels like he's being rejected by the entire world. So in one of the foster homes that I was in, I had a much older, super pretty foster sister. She was one of these sort of 1970s bad girls with the mini skirts and everything, but she was super popular. She, was popular with all kinds of guys and girls. She had this huge entourage that followed her around. And when I looked at her life and I compared her life to my life, I was like, wow, why couldn't that be my life, right? And that's when I started sort of experimenting with what we would now call transgender expression. The term wasn't in the vernacular at that time, but I began sort of dressing up in her clothes and putting on makeup and sort of imagining myself as the super pretty, popular girl in school. But the thing is that I did that quite a bit, and I did it over an extended period of time. And the thing is if that had happened today, the school system and probably the social welfare system too would have sort of affirmed that. Right. And they would have said, okay, well, here we have a girl trapped in a boy's body. And I've actually seen like Oxford scientists using expressions like that, like a girl trapped in a boy's body. But my sort of response to that is always that I don't see myself as having been a girl trapped in a boy's body, crying out for my true identity. I was a wounded child crying out for help. Because I was wounded and I was looking for a new identity. So again, like what you're saying there about, that it makes sense to you, of course. So we've got all of these rejected kids out there looking for, a new sense of identity and stuff. And they're surrounded by this sort of affirmation system at every level. And so, yes, it looks like we've got very high rates of transitioning in this extraordinarily vulnerable demographic, but like that's just being a foster kid. Now you can imagine when you've got like comorbid conditions like autism or whatever, right? And plus the system would pay for everything, right? As well. So that makes it even easier for them. And so that kind of sort of sets up this victimization system, I would argue. And like I say, that's sort of what sort of mobilized me and said that I, as a former foster child, knowing what these kids go through, this is my job. Okay, I can't sit back. I've got to go after this aggressively and push for a national inquiry.
It's so interesting to me that both of us are in this coming from different angles, because I first got involved when I realized they were trying to ban the very therapy that helped me resolve my transgender identity as a kid. It sounds like you ended up embracing a transgender identity and probably really needed something in order to deal with the situation you were in. What bothers me the most about this is that it's not just that these kids are being affirmed as being transgender, it's that they're told they're inherently flawed. And to fix that, they should harm themselves. They should engage in what I would call medically approved self-harm.
Yeah, well, yeah, and self-harm, of course, this is a big feature of a lot of these transgender youths is that they have histories of self-harm. So, yeah, I mean, what I should say about myself, though, is that I was not affirmed when I was a kid. So in that home that I'm talking about, I had a foster father who was sort of an old school World War II veteran and a Christian, and he caught me doing, because like I was kind of reckless. I would get dressed up all sort of 1970s bad girl, and I'd go around town walking around, and only when I thought nobody was there. And one day I came back from one of these jaunts around town, came into the house, and my foster father was home. Okay, and he saw me like this, and he was like, "Whoa, what is this?" After a moment of shock, though, he got angry and he said, "Listen, you can't be doing this, right? This is dangerous behavior. Furthermore, you are not a girl, you're a boy." So I was sort of actively dissuaded from that behavior. And so I guess you would say I was forced into the, see, I want to be careful here because everyone's in the LGBTQ community is going to try to do sort of false equivalencies, sort of forced into the closet in the sense that like it wasn't acceptable, right, in the household. Not only was it not acceptable in the household, it wasn't acceptable in society in general when I was young, because that was back in the 80s. And in the interior, especially in the interior of British Columbia where I grew up, like that type of thing, just forget about it, right? Was not acceptable until probably into the 2000s, into the new millennium. So I never sort of stepped into that fully, and I ended up having to sort of go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and wasn't able able to sort of do it more openly until I moved to the lower mainland by Vancouver when I was older. So, but I think that was actually, it was a good thing because it forced me to stay tethered to physical reality,
Mhm.
and I could sort of experiment with it as I wanted and sort of express myself as I wanted, but I was never sort of allowed to sort of digress into that. And I think that that is a good reason, or a good thing in my opinion, because not only did it keep me tethered to physical reality, it kept me physically whole. Because if I'd been affirmed, I might have gone on to use a Lupron and the synthetic hormones, and who knows, maybe even gone on to get surgery and stuff like that. So I'm actually grateful that I was not affirmed in that. Um, so
And
that's,
you're still alive.
and I'm still alive. Okay,
And
so
that's the narrative now, is that a child like you in your situation, especially because you were vulnerable as a foster child, that you would kill yourself if you weren't affirmed. And so you're living proof that that's not true.
right. Well, this is one of the things that gets me into trouble. In my public talks, I look at all the suicide statistics that they're using. And I don't know if you've looked at that, but all of the data that they're using is all self reports. There's like no forensic data used whatsoever. It's just purely self reports. And
Well, and methodologically, the studies are really flawed because they're self-selected self-reports. So
oh, yeah.
it's people who are choosing to disclose their story,
Mhm.
um, and they have an agenda behind that. And
Ah,
so, people who are either, you know, living, have resolved their trans identity and moved on, aren't going to be included in that research. And someone like yourself isn't going to be included in that research. Someone who's a really different narrative going on, because as I understand it, you're very aware that you are a biological male.
yes. Well, I mean, again, that sort of the fact that I wasn't affirmed sort of forced me to stay tethered to physical, knowable reality. So I've never sort of gotten it into my head. I say maybe I've flirted with the idea from time to time, but I've never got it into my head that I am or ever could be a woman. And I understood transgender identity as a mode of expressing oneself and interacting with the world in general, but it didn't actually change my sex. I will always be male. And because this, when I became a young man, also sort of turned into a sexual thing, right? It's like kind of hard to ignore that. So, yeah, I've always retained that. Like when you're, and it's kind of interesting because I've sort of got the long view over time of how has evolved. And I've had a lot of interactions with males who are attracted to transgender persons, such as myself. And there's like a game that kind of goes on there in the relationship between yourself and a guy, because most of these guys actually describe themselves as heterosexual, right? And that's like sort of mental gymnastics because they know that physically I'm male. That's what's attracted them. Like they wouldn't be attracted to me if they didn't know that I had all the male parts and stuff, right? So there's like this psychological dance almost that goes on between yourself and other people. And so I've always sort of been aware of the psychology behind it. And I haven't felt a need to try to sort of deny physical reality. I was sort of comfortable to express myself in any way I want and interact any way I wanted.
And I'm assuming that's why you're advocating for kids, because um, you know what it's like to be in the foster care system. I know what it's like to have sort of a traumatic childhood, a lot of things going on. There was no way I was competent to make a choice about my health care when I was a child. I'm barely competent now. But definitely when I was a child, there was no way I could make informed, good choices about my health care. And so that's one of the things that bothers me about this, is that children as young as 8 years old are being put on Lupron, which is a puberty blocker, has tremendous side effects. Here in the US, there's even kids as young as 8 years old being put on cross-sex hormones. So in tandem with the puberty blockers, they're put on cross-sex hormones. They will never go through a natural puberty. And then girls as young as 13 are having their breasts amputated. And I'm not sure if it's that severe in Canada or not, but I do know that there are cases where kids are, In the schools, the teachers are actually identifying kids, sending them to school counselors. The counselors are then kind of encouraging this adoption of a transgender identity. And then there are clinics in Canada that are perfectly willing to start administering these treatments to kids when they're really not old enough to consent.
Right. So again, like knowing my state of mind when I was a child, had I been affirmed in that identity, I have very little doubt that I would have just fallen right into that. I was sure I can get rid of my old lousy self and create a whole new me
I
and the
can
whole
be like
world.
that big sister of mine who's so popular.
Right, right, right. And
Yeah.
I can be
Heck
popular.
yeah.
I can start again and be somebody new. Yes, absolutely. So I would have fallen right into that. And um, I mean, even when I was a teen, I mean, every teenager is sort of an old sort of saying, basically, that every teenager knows everything, and until they get to be adults when they realize they knew nothing, right? And so yes, even teenagers are not competent, I think, to make these decisions. And so my sort of push here in Canada is that nobody under the age of 19, because the legal drinking age here in Canada is 19. So I think a good age would be 19. Nobody under the age of 19 should be permitted to engage in medical transitioning of any sort, including pharmaceutical methods. And certainly, like we've got the one case here, and I know you talked to somebody. I'm not going to say who, I can't reference, but
Parent.
there is a case here in BC where we had a father who was forced to transition his daughter to a boy. Right. I was sort of the first person to report on that. I wrote the first story about that case for the post millennial in Canada, and it sort of went global after that
And
because it
in,
was
in
such.
my mind, that's so shocking that a parent would lose authority over
Yeah.
their child to determine what healthcare is appropriate.
Right. Well, I think BC is it's almost like a lot of things are tested here in BC. We've got this wonderful individual by the name of Morgan Auger who seems to be pushing a lot of buttons
So for
here.
people who don't know who he is, can you explain?
Morgan Auger is a transgender identified male, much like myself. He's former vice president of the New Democratic Party in British Columbia, which is the ruling party in British Columbia. He recently stepped down from that position, but he's also like a transgender rights advocate, and he was involved in Bill C-16 here in Canada, and anything to do with transgender stuff in Canada, really. So he's become kind of well known around the globe too.
And that bill
But
that you mentioned, is that the one that requires people to use preferred pronouns?
oh, well, that was the fear. Okay, that was kind of a fear that was put out there by Jordan Peterson and company.
Right.
But like as far as I know, like we've got a lot of politicians here, we'll say on the right, who are talking about Bill C-16. Like it's if we can get rid of Bill C-16, then this is going to be a major triumph. As far as I know, Bill C-16 has not been applied to any legal decision or policy, major policy decision in Canada since its passing in 2017, I think it was. So it's really not like if you like I tell people, like if we could get rid of Bill C-16 tomorrow, nothing would change in terms of what's happening to our kids in schools and like trampling parental rights and stuff. This is all almost exclusively based on provincial laws, which would be the equivalent of state laws there in the U.S. And what I would say is that in the case of this father forced to transition his daughter, it was based on something called the BC Infants Act, which was put in place to give minors, what they call mature minors, the ability to have things such as get vaccinations if their parents don't approve of it, or to, if it's say a 14-year-old girl that's pregnant or something, she can get an abortion without her parents being involved. So it was put in place for these sort of medical types of procedures, and it has now been sort of extended to apply to transgender procedures as well. But the thing is that although, as far as we know, in Canada anyway, this is the only case that we are aware of. But I mean, because of privacy provisions, we don't even know. This could be going on like en masse. It might just be luck that we came across this one particular case. But almost every other province in Canada, and probably in the States too, you would be a better or have better knowledge than me in this regard, but certainly in every other province in Canada, similar laws are on the books, and it may just be a matter of time before they start doing similar things in these other provinces and maybe in the States.
Well, I know that I have been in touch with a number of parents here in the US who are in a situation similar to the case in Canada, where a parent is objecting to the medical transitioning of their child. I suspect that there are far more cases than we're aware of, because these parents are harassed. They are they are called transphobic. They are told that their children will kill themselves if they don't allow the transition. And so I suspect that there are parents who would otherwise not support this, that have been bullied into accepting it and are afraid to speak out publicly, because the trans rights activists really are bullies, and they also have a lot of money. So they have lawyers. They can just sort of plow through the court systems when, a parent who is struggling to make ends meet, there's no way that they're going to be able to launch a court case to try and protect their child.
Yeah, and I'd say that the school counselors and probably maybe psychologists to a certain degree too are engaging in what could be called a form of emotional terrorism with parents. I know one person who works with schools here in British Columbia, who goes from school to school, sort of educating parents on transgender issues. And I listened to her once, and she was saying that she talks to a lot of parents who say, well, we think that we want to just sort of hold off and discourage our kid from transitioning until they're a young adult, because we think this is an adult decision and they should just hold off. And she says that what she says to the parents at that point is, well, what makes you think that your child's still going to be alive when they're a young adult? This
Wow.
is emotional terrorism, right?
And this is a so-called expert
Mm.
that parents are likely to listen to because the school brought her
Schools.
in as
Yeah.
an expert. So, yeah, I can't imagine being a parent in that situation.
Right. Oh yeah, the guilt trip. It's like, okay, so if you don't go along with this affirmation model, then you're endangering the life of your child. And again, they go back to all of these suicide studies that are based on bad data in an absence of, like, I've looked at so many different sort of suicide studies and transgender issues, and over and over and over and over again, I don't think I've ever seen one that actually refers to actual forensic data. Right. But the thing is that these are experts. Okay. These are trained professionals, and they know, right? They know the importance of forensic data. So the fact that they are deliberately excluding that information from their studies is indicative of a problem that got me into trouble here in BC, because in my public talks, I've been doing public talks for about 2 years. I've been sort of active and involved in this subject, like I say, over 3 years, but I began public speaking about 2 years ago. And for the first little bit, I was just touring churches and stuff, because I figured I needed to wake up the Christian community to get involved in this, because they got all the numbers and stuff, right? And when I first began doing public talks, I got very limited pushback. There were some protests and stuff, but not a lot. Eventually, I stopped doing my church talks and I decided to go out to the general community. But at that point, I sort of changed the entire focus of my speaking. And one of the big sections that I put into my public talks was a focus on the role of pharmaceutical companies in terms of conflicts of interest with the scientists who are doing this research. And so I started sort of exposing some of the conflicts of interest there. And when I did that, okay, that is when all hell broke loose here in BC. That is when the whole establishment came down on me, and I ended up with, crowds of hundreds of people protesting me and trying to shut me down. We had police stand downs at one of my talk, where they knew they were expecting 800 protesters at my one event, and the city and the police decided to send no police officers until
Wow.
chaos had broken out at the event. And then finally they sent police just to sort of come in and say, okay, we have to shut this down.
Wow.
but that sort of chaos that broke out at that time happens to coincide when I began talking about the pharmaceutical industry.
Interesting. And that's where I look at this, and the only thing I can figure out is that people are making a lot of money, and That's why they're so invested in it, because otherwise none of this makes any sense. You know, the
Mm.
argument is that we need to get to these kids before they go through puberty. Basically, the argument is because we don't want them to be unattractive identified males or unattractive identified females. And there's no other case that I can think of where people feel like they have an intrinsic right to be attractive. And that's what this whole thing is based on, is that we want, you know, if a child is transgender and they go through puberty, they may not be as attractive as the gender they identify with. And to me, the fact, I mean, this is basically all about cosmetic and external appearance. And yet the medications that these kids are being given are going to have lifelong side effects. They are going to damage these kids. I can't imagine, you know, a 13, 14-year-old girl being forced into menopause and what that is going to do to her over her life. It's going, you know, the long-term implications are staggering.
Yeah. Well, just sort of to expand on what you were saying, there's an old saying that says some things don't make sense until expressed in dollars and cents,
Mm.
right? So yes, the pharmaceutical, I mean, if you look at Lupron alone, and there are other drugs based on, I guess, the same chemical formula, but Lupron is sort of the big one. And if you look at Abvi's sales for Lupron, the last year I looked at it was something like $800 million. Now, they do use that drug for other conditions, right? So it's not all transgender, but an $800 million payday is pretty big, and you know, an exponentially expanding marketplace as well. So
And
there
a
is that.
lifelong
A
means.
lifelong, not only a lifelong customer that you're getting there, but a lifelong customer for any new developments along the sort of those lines later on in life. So it's a huge potential cash cow. But something this sort of systemic, that's sort of in every sort of level of society, there's something else going there. I believe there's a systemic push to do this. And when I first got into this, is actually kind of interesting, because when I first began, well, this is actually my early in my talk tour where I began talking about pharmaceutical things. And I did a talk in a town, and there was an Aboriginal leader there who has been involved in all kinds of Aboriginal rights things, and he's been to the UN and stuff. And at the end of my talk, he says, well, you know, it's very interesting, all the stuff about the pharmacies and stuff like that. And I tend to agree with you, but you do realize that this has to do with population control, don't you?
Mm.
And when he told me that, I was like, at that time, I was like, I don't know if that's really something that's really involved here. But the more I've sort of looked at this, and the more that we see all of this talk about the Earth and planet in jeopardy, and we're overpopulated and all this stuff, suddenly it starts making, you know, it doesn't seem quite so crazy to me. Maybe there is something
I
like
mean,
that
these
going
kids are
on.
being sterilized.
They are.
Bottom
They are.
line is they're being sterilized.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yes, yeah. I mean, look what happened to poor Jazz Jennings. As Jazz Jennings' genitals were stunted so much that there was barely enough material to use when Jazz actually did the surgery, right? But I mean, that sort of indicates that Jazz was basically chemically castrated, right, in that process. So there, that is happening, and it's happening in large numbers now. So my background, so my educational background is in history and political science, and I sort of studied how governments manipulate populations and stuff like that. And my sort of opinion that I got out of years of study was that the people at the top of our society are the ultimate multitaskers, right? They don't like to do one thing. And, you know, if you can do 10 things at the same time, do 10 things at the same time. So I doubt that there's any one factor that's driving this. Yes, pharmaceutical is a big factor because there's billions of dollars potential profits here, and that is powerful. But I think there is more than that, and I think population control might be one of them.
Yeah, I also feel pretty strongly that there is part of this movement is to lower the age of consent so that, you know, this whole idea of children having right to sex is really being pushed. And if you lower the age of medical consent, it becomes much easier to lower the age of sexual consent.
Right. So if you can consent to change your sex, you can probably consent to have sex, right? I mean, like the consenting to have sex would seem to be a minor decision compared to the decision to totally change your body into the opposite sex, right? So that sort of makes sense to me too. That there may be that trend too, because I don't know what your background is, but certainly my encounters with people in what we'll call elite circles, sort of upper echelon, particularly in academia and stuff, they have a total different attitude about child sexuality. You can see this in people like Elwood Kinsey, for instance, and uh, Camille Paglia. Okay, so here's Camille Pag. I don't know if you know what she's been up to, but she's out there basically saying that the age of consent should be dropped everywhere to 14. But she has said that she doesn't think that there should be any laws prohibiting sexual interaction, which we'll call consensual sexual interaction between adults and children of any age.
Wow.
So there
Well, and
is
I'm
this.
I'm curious because based on your experience in the foster care system, I wasn't in a foster care system, but I had parents who were very uh, absent, I guess is the word.
Mhm.
And I became sexually active at a very young age, became involved with adults in high school. I was doing some prostitution in high school. Um, and I look back on that and I'm horrified that that nobody protected me from it, that people sort of turned their back on what was going on because physically it's not healthy. You know, you expose kids to all kinds of dangers when they start engaging in sex, but emotionally it's also very difficult. Kids just aren't capable of sort of navigating relationships, especially with grown-ups. They're easily manipulated, and I'm not sure if you had that experience or not, but that's one of the reasons why I'm so protective of kids, is that I know what it's like to be in a situation where I'm manipulated by adults, and I feel like I'm in control, but retrospectively I realize I was completely exploited. I was completely taken advantage of.
Yeah, well, there's a power imbalance there when you're talking about adults and kids. And that's one of the primary reasons that we've got these laws, right? Because we understand that power imbalance and that adults can manipulate kids. With me, yeah, I sort of saw some of that myself in the foster care system. I think the first time I was what I'll call taken advantage of sexually, I was about 5. But and it's a weird thing because sort of like you were saying there, that you felt like you were in control. Even when I was 5, I felt like I'd entered into some sort of agreement with the offending party. So it wasn't experienced sort of as raw trauma. But the thing about that I always found curious is that first sort of sexual exploitation, I remember that day crystal clear now, decades later. There was something about the experience that just like burned into my brain, and I've never forgotten that. But moving on further, like when I was 13, I was in a foster home where both of my foster parents were hardcore alcoholics. So I was sort of out and about and stuff. And at that time, at 13, there were men who began. So they sort of saw me as this sort of I guess, wild creature that could be brought into their lair to take advantage of, and they did. So,
Well, and that's what I see a lot of when it just looks like grooming to me when I see these adults who are swarming around these kids who are trans identified, and saying, you don't need your parents, you don't need your family, I'll be your family. It really just, to me, it just looks like grooming. It looks like predatory adults really swooping in
it's
and taking
worse.
advantage of kids, and it just creeps me out.
Yeah, it's worse. It's worse than grooming. It's cult psychology that's being used. So we talk about Rachel McKinnon. I've talked about Rachel McKinnon. I don't know if you know who Rachel is, but
She's
Rachel
the bicycle. Is that?
won the world championship. But
Yeah.
Rachel is a professor of philosophy at Charleston College too, and does these at least used to do these regular web shows talking about transgender issues. And in the context of that show, Rachel went on and was talking to transgender kids and basically saying what you said there, which is that if you're not being supported by your parents, you don't have to put up with that. You can walk away from unsupportive parents, and what you can do is come to us, your glitter family, and we're just as real and just as important as your real family, even more important, is because we're going to support you. That is is cult psychology, right?
Yeah,
That
and
is
that's when I
classic.
look at this, it looks so much like a cult, and especially when I talk to the parents who have lost their kids to it, it really seems like a cult. It's phenomenal hearing their stories.
Well, that's kind of what put me on the map and this whole transgender thing, sort of around the globe, is I wrote an essay almost 3 years ago now called Synanon, the Brainwashing Game in Modern Transgender Activism. And what I did in there was I compared the transgender activist psychology and recruitment methods that I was observing at that time to the Synanon cult and to some other cults in terms of their methodologies and the
Oh,
psychology of the people getting involved. And there were direct correlations there.
wow. It's so discouraging.
Mhm.
So instead of sort of letting this go on, you have decided to call for this national inquiry in Canada. Tell me about that and what it would entail, because I guess part of me is so cynical that I think, well, they might do this inquiry and just even come to the conclusion that they should recruit even more kids to this rather than that there's something wrong. So what is this inquiry, and how do you control it so that it actually looks at things with some degree of objectivity?
It's a $25,000 question. Well, first of all, you need critical eyes in there. Okay, so I have been really sort of, okay, if we get a national inquiry, you need to get me in there, not because I'm promoting myself, but because everybody knows that I am a critical eye, right? And you need maybe other critical eyes like me in there as well. When they announced their inquiry in the UK, the first thing that I noticed is that the person that they appointed to oversee the inquiry had ties to the pharmaceutical industry. And I was like, what are you guys doing? This, like, I haven't, like, I don't know all of the outcomes that are going to come out of that inquiry, but just that alone was like, how could you let somebody with pharmaceutical ties
Yeah.
guide your inquiry? So I would say that, okay, what I'm been advocating for, and the people supporting me and people I'm working with have been advocating for, is an investigation. So we're talking about this. There is this case of the father who was forced to transition his daughter. There's a lot of stuff that sort of went on there with some of the doctors, and then I talk about the foster kid cases, and that a lot of the evidence that we have right now is just verbal. We don't have access to actual documents and stuff. So we want an inquiry that would have the power to subpoena doctors' records, so we can find out how many kids are transitioning, what their backgrounds are, all of these types of things. Get all of that information together and sort of assess what the problem is and what the sort of transitioning rates and stuff are, and then start looking at the same time at some of the causative factors. So before I started pushing for a national inquiry, I was busy opposing Shoji 123 in British Columbia, which is an educational brainwashing program, I call it, in our schools, which is sort of romancing all of these young, confused kids into thinking that they might be the wrong sex, right? So there are things like this that I would call causative that need to be investigated. The case, by the way, um, I got to be careful here because I'm at a court order. But
Well, while you're thinking about that, I just want
yeah.
to tell people who don't know about Soji that much like much of the comprehensive sexuality education here in the U.S., they actually go in and tell kids as young as kindergarten that it's possible that they're born in the wrong body, that they're inherently flawed, and the appropriate response to that is to basically self-harm, to damage their bodies with these hormones and puberty blockers and
Mm.
operations. And so this is happening now. It's happening at really young ages. And so you and I sort of developed a transgender identity when we were really little. We are we are not the norm of what's happening now. We are sort of that 0.002% that
Mm.
used to have gender identity disorder, or whatever you want to call it. These days, the vast majority of kids who are um, identifying as transgender are kind of, I believe, being brainwashed because they're being exposed to this idea very early. And
Mm.
young children depend on adults to tell them about reality. And if they're starting to hear that they could be born in the wrong body at an early age, I can't imagine what kid wouldn't wonder if maybe they were born in the wrong body.
Right. It's actually worse than that. Okay. It's worse than that. So I use the term romancing because, well, first of all, Soji 123 is designed to sort of push these ideas starting in kindergarten, but all the way through. And it
Mhm.
says right in the government guidelines that they should try to put Soji material into every course and as much as possible. Right. So they are saturating these kids' minds with this subject. But when they start on them in kindergarten, they are giving them books like the I Am Jazz picture book. Okay, and then what this does is it sells this sort of romantic fairy tale of a boy who transforms into a girl because he didn't realize, but he was really secretly a girl, and he sort of blossomed into his
A
new. It's like a
butterfly.
yeah, it's like a classic fairy tale, and anybody who sort of I don't know if it's still that way today, but certainly when I was a kid, when I read sort of fantasy stories like that when I was a kid, one of the books that I read about, I don't know, a dozen times when I was a kid was Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, right?
Mhm.
And this book just sort of took over my mind, and I sort of like, this is like a wow, what a wonderful far out world. And that is the power of these books that they're giving to these kids, selling them these magical fairy tales. And whereas, with Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, I knew that I was never going to see a Willy Wonka, right? In this case, they are telling these kids that this fantasy can be their reality anytime they choose. So they start sort of romancing them in this way, very young. And in the case of the father forced to transition his daughter, we have a direct correlation. So we know that she, in her class, was exposed to Soji 123 materials, including a particular documentary about a boy who no, it was a girl who identified as a boy and basically cut off all of her hair one day and began, identifying that way. And it was after watching that documentary in school that she went home and began identifying as a boy. So there's a direct correlation between materials that they are providing in the schools and the psychology that's going on. So that would be a big part of any sort of inquiry, is to looking at the causative factors and answering some of these difficult questions about autism, because I don't know what your research has showed you, but I've seen that autism rates amongst transgender youths varies between 8% at the low end up to 54% in some studies, right? So we say it's somewhere in the middle, about 30%, right? And a lot of people the first time I tell them this, they go, okay, they don't sort of get why that's a big number. I said, do you realize that in the general population, autism spectrum is about 1.7% of the child population? For it to be 30%, for it to be even 8%, right, at the low end, is startling, right? And that is a concern. So all of this stuff needs to be investigated. And my goal would be to say that, look, we're destroying the bodies of these young people. They're being, put into impossible situations they're not prepared to deal with. And furthermore, they're being one of the stories that I wrote for the post millennial here in Canada was called "The Pied Pipers of Gender Ideology." Right, so they're being led astray by what I would call primarily a financially vested pharmaceutical complex, right? So this all needs to end, in my opinion, and we need to get this stuff out of the schools. The SOTI 123 addresses sort of sexual orientation and gender ideology. My primary concern is the gender ideology, because if somebody if a youth is identifying as gay, they're not going to make radical changes to their body. But with the sexual orientation, this can cause serious, permanent, irreversible harm. And I believe any material that puts these ideas in the minds of children needs to be removed.
And that's where I feel it's so different, that the two are there's very little overlap, because if the child identifies as gay, uh, that's it, they're gay. They
Mm.
don't go and they don't do things to their bodies. They don't have to become addicted to hormones for the rest of their lives. They don't go through menopause when they're in teenage years. They don't do surgeries to mutilate their bodies. They just happen to want to have sex with a certain type of person. And that's so fundamentally different than what's happening to these kids. And one of the things you mentioned was the, perhaps financial inducements that some of these doctors have. I was just curious. There's a doctor that I'm familiar with in Canada who has sort of been a big proponent of transitioning kids. Is there any way to find out how much these doctors are getting from pharmaceutical companies?
Okay, so this is a big problem that we have in Canada that's unique to Canada. Like in the United States, there is reporting mechanisms. So the companies have to sort of report who they're giving money to in the United States. We don't have anything like that here in Canada. We need something like that, and maybe that can be brought up in the process of an inquiry. Certainly, we would have to. Particularly in high-profile cases like the leading gender specialist in British Columbia is Dr. Wallace Wong. In his case, we need to summon all of his records and figure out, who's he been getting money from and what are the transition rates for all of these kids. This type of stuff needs to be made public information, of course, protecting the identity of the kids.
Well, was he the doctor who suggested the high rate of foster care kids?
Yes. So, well, he did it accidentally, though. Okay, so he did a public talk where he was talking to parents about various things about transgender identity, and in the course of that, he was describing how uh, uh, transgender identity has grown and how it's been difficult for him to manage it. And he said, "I have 1,000 child patients in my practice, and of those 1,000 patients, 500 come from the Ministry of Child and Family Development." And like he just sort of said it casually, like it was no big deal. But when I heard him say that, I was like, whoa,
Whoa.
what
Yeah.
do you mean half of your patients are coming from the ministry, right?
Wow.
But the thing is that's just sort of, okay, that's just a statement. Now, we don't know how that breaks down, right? So we need to get access to his records and determine, okay, who are these kids? Like, are they foster kids? Are they orphans? Are they kids who are living on their own but are being supported by the state? All of these types of things. I'm not that I'm, if you've got these sort of emancipated children who are being supported by the state, not that transitioning is going to be any sort of better than a child who's still in a foster home, right? That still would be a vulnerable, maybe even a more vulnerable child,
Right.
right?
Either way, these are vulnerable children. I mean,
Right. So that number, like when I saw that, like when I got that or listened to that presentation by Dr. Wallace Wong, I had been maybe doing this for about a year and a half, and when I heard him say that, not only did it shock me, but when I processed the numbers and stuff, I said, "This is a game changer." Okay, this needs to get out to the public. But I will tell you something, Aaron. The media en masse, right, left, center, alternative, has done everything in their power to keep this information from the public.
it's so
Um,
true. It's shockingly true. When I testified at the legislature here in Utah, I believe one of the media outlets here covered it, and they said there were a few members of a hate group that testified against the legislation. So here I had no affiliation whatsoever with anybody. I just went down there of my own free will because I wanted to tell my story, and suddenly I was identified as a member of a hate group. And the fact that they even mentioned it, because a lot of times they don't even mention that there's anybody who has an ulterior story to tell, that they have a different perspective, that perhaps these medical interventions are incredibly harmful, and the media will not. I mean, it boggles my mind. That's actually why I started making these videos, because I feel like I have to do something to get the information out there so that people
mhm.
know what's going on, because right now they've been totally bamboozled, and they think, oh, of course we're going to support these poor kids, we got to love them and give them the medically necessary treatment, and we've got to get information out there. So how is there anything we can do to support your efforts in Canada to get this inquiry going?
Well, if any of your viewers are from Canada, they can go to the petition on the Government of Canada's website that we have launched. Hopefully, you can put maybe a link to that
Certainly.
under the show, and people can go there and sign the petition. It's a government petition and has real sort of meaning. The more people we get to sign that petition, the better. Anybody out there who knows anybody who's Canadian, get them on this. And this should be an easy one. It's not one where we're saying we don't want any kids transitioning. What we're doing with this petition is we're saying we want an investigation to determine these questions, right? So it's an easy one. Okay, anybody who supports and claims to care about kids should be fully supportive of this inquiry. So that would be a big thing. Fortunately, here in Canada, we had a sort of a major kind of a major breakthrough in terms of visibility, because one of the candidates for the leadership of the Conservative Party of Canada, Derek Sloan, agreed to sponsor my call for an inquiry and table it in the House of Commons. That is a major development. So just for your American viewers who may not know, basically this is a guy who is seeking to be the next Prime Minister of Canada. As one of the two main parties in Canada. So for him to come on board and say that he's supporting my call for a national inquiry is huge, or should be huge in terms of visibility. But once again, back to the media. Right. So we put out a press release on this, and the only media outlet that covered it was LifeSite News, the Christian website. All of the mainstream media totally ignored it. This is
It
a
is
huge
bizarre.
thing.
Yeah, it's bizarre to me. I just heard about a lawsuit of biological males who were prescribed testosterone. And I believe they won a lawsuit against AbbVie because they weren't told of the significant and serious and long-term side effects that would result from taking testosterone. And this was men.
I would say that we not only need a national inquiry in Canada, everywhere where this is going on, there should be inquiries into what is happening. Because I said when I did my first sort of press release calling for a national inquiry, I said that the numbers about foster kids, for instance, in BC, if that is going on in British Columbia, it's probably going on in Alberta, in Quebec, and Ontario, all across Canada. But we can extend that. It's probably going on in Washington State, in Utah, in California, everywhere. So this is something that needs to be investigated everywhere. If we could ever get this information out en masse, I think we would be in a much better situation, because I think the average person, given the facts that you and I know, is going to be alarmed by what's going on.
So it's interesting that you mentioned the media, because that's been one of my frustrations, is the fact that they absolutely are not covering what's happening. When there's legislation here in the States, they call it transphobic legislation, and they do not present the facts of the case. They merely present sort of the pro-transgender narrative. And I, for the life of me, can't figure out if it's just that they're afraid of being bullied by activists if they report a well-rounded story, or if they don't care about kids, or I can't figure it out. Do you have any insights?
Well, I think one of the things that we have to sort of keep in mind is that the media tends to be heavily funded by the pharmaceutical complex. Okay, media gets an awful lot of money from Big Pharma, so that's going to play a role. But there's also, like, at the sort of editorial level of most of these media outlets, they are selecting people who are of, and Noam Chomsky got into this whole thing about how information is controlled without actually telling people what to do. An editor at a newspaper, or a news director or whatever, will select people who think the appropriate way, and then they sort of just do their thing. So I think a lot of people were bent that way when they got into the media. So I had a journalist here in British Columbia who said to me in the course of my, because it was like a big event that took place here where I live, outside one of my talks. There was like an old man was harassed, and somebody was nearly run down, and there's all these protesters and stuff. And I was asking this media guy why they weren't covering the story, right? And he said to me, well, you're a nobody, and I plan on making sure you stay a nobody.
Interesting.
Okay, so that's the kind of attitude that you get. But like, this is just this one person at this one newspaper, but I have encountered multiple people like this. I remember I did an interview with a reporter in our capital, Victoria, BC here, and I stood outside the legislature with him, talking for well over an hour, and he seemed like a decent enough guy. And I thought, okay, maybe this guy's going to give me a fair shake. But when he went to press with the story based on our interview, he totally just sort of did a hit piece on me and totally misrepresented everything. So there he sort of sat there, right, pretending to be nice and friendly, and I'm going to be fair, and then he just total hit piece.
Wow.
And this
So
is the psychology of the people who are being hired in the media.
Exactly. Well, I am very grateful that you are standing up for kids. I think that, um, you're somebody who should be listened to because of your life experience, in a way that it is so critical. And
Mhm.
I appreciate all your efforts. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about before we end this?
Mm, No, if people want more information on me, they can go to my blog, which they can get to by going to www.jensmith.ca. Jen Smith is one word, and there's more information about me there. I've got a YouTube show called The Agenda that's on tonight, actually, so people can check out that too if they want to get updates. But the main thing is for any Canadian viewers out there, you got to sign this petition and get others to sign it.
And if you know any Canadians, yeah,
Yes.
let's get this started because the longer we wait, every day there are more and more kids that are being damaged by this. So
Yeah.
we really need to move on it quickly. And I really appreciate your efforts, Jen.